When William's phone rang at midnight, he knew. The palace never calls at that hour, unless everything's about to shatter. Kate appeared in the doorway, her face draining of color, as she watched him answer, both summoned to Windsor Castle immediately. No explanation given. Racing through fog-thick darkness, William gripped the wheel so hard, his hands shook, haunted by ghosts of other late-night calls that tore his world apart. Diana, Philip, now his father. Inside Windsor's stone corridors, Charles stood broken and trembling. Stage 4 cancer. Months to live. 18 months as king after waiting 74 years. William dropped to his knees, gripping his father's hands, as the crown he'd never wanted came crashing toward him. George was only 10, the same age William was when his mother died. But this time, Kate whispered the words that changed everything. "We face it together." As Charles took his final breath at dawn, the palace lights extinguished one by one, and Catherine stood watching the darkness spread, whispering to the night, "It's over." The laughter had finally faded upstairs. William could still hear the echo of it, Louis shrieking as Charlotte chased him down the hallway. George's deeper voice calling after them to be quiet, though he'd been laughing too. The sounds of bedtime at Adelaide Cottage, the sounds of normalcy. Kate had gone up 20 minutes ago to supervise teeth brushing and negotiate one more story, and the house had settled into that particular quiet that comes when children are finally, blessedly, asleep. He'd been reading, or pretending to read, some biography a staffer had recommended. The kind of book he picked up because he was supposed to, not because he wanted to. The lamp beside him cast a warm circle of light across the sofa, and beyond the windows, the November darkness pressed close. It was the sort of evening that made him grateful for small spaces, for rooms that didn't echo, for houses that felt like homes instead of monuments. When his phone rang, he didn't recognize the number. That should have been his first warning. Nobody called him from numbers he didn't recognize. His mobile was locked down, vetted, sanitized of anything unexpected. But the screen glowed with an unfamiliar string of digits, and something in his chest tightened before he even answered. "Yes, sir." The voice was clipped, formal, male. One of the palace aides, though William couldn't place which one. "I'm calling on behalf of His Majesty." William sat up straighter. The book slid from his lap, forgotten. "What's wrong?" There was a pause. Just a fraction too long. "His Majesty requests your immediate presence at Windsor Castle this evening. Both you and the Princess of Wales." "Tonight?" William glanced at his watch. "Nearly 11. What's happened?" "I'm not at liberty to say, sir. His Majesty asked that you come as soon as possible." The formality of it, the careful non-answers, made his pulse quicken. This wasn't about a diary clash or a last-minute schedule change. This was something else, something they wouldn't say over the phone, something that required both of them in the middle of the night. "We'll be there within the hour," William said, and ended the call. His hand was shaking. He stared at the phone for a moment, at his own trembling fingers, and tried to breathe. Late-night calls. He knew about late-night calls. The worst moments of his life had started this way, a ring in the darkness, a voice delivering news that cleaved the world into before and after. Diana, Philip, each time, this same sick lurch in his stomach, this same knowledge that whatever came next would change everything. "William?" He looked up. Kate stood in the doorway, still in the jeans and sweater she'd worn all day, hair pulled back in a ponytail. She must have heard his voice. Come down to see who'd called so late. She was looking at him with that expression he'd learned to recognize over 15 years together, the one that meant she was reading him, cataloging every micro-expression, every tells he didn't even know he was broadcasting. "We have to go," he said. His voice sounded strange, distant. "To Windsor. Now. Both of us." She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just looked at his face, and he watched her own expression shift, watched the color drain from her cheeks. "The children," she said quietly. "Sleeping. We'll have to call someone. Maria maybe, or I'll text her." Kate was already pulling out her phone, fingers moving across the screen. "She can be here in 20 minutes. I'll leave a note for the morning staff." They moved through the house like choreographed dancers, each knowing their part without discussion. Kate went upstairs to check on the children one more time, to make sure they were deeply asleep, to kiss foreheads that wouldn't remember being kissed. William found his shoes, his jacket, his wallet, and keys, the mundane objects of ordinary life that felt absurd in the face of whatever was waiting for them. Maria arrived in 18 minutes, sleepy but asking no questions. The night security staff were already aware they'd be leaving. Someone from the palace had called ahead. Everything moved with the smooth, terrible efficiency of an emergency that powerful people were trying to contain. Kate came down the stairs with her coat already on, her face composed but pale. She'd tied her hair back more neatly, touched up her makeup, not vanity, just armor. The Princess of Wales had to look a certain way, even at midnight, even in crisis, especially in crisis. They said nothing as they walked to the car. William drove, because driving gave him something to do with his hands, something to focus on besides the mounting dread. Kate settled into the passenger seat and reached for her seatbelt, and neither of them spoke as he pulled out of the drive and onto the dark country road. The headlights cut through fog that had rolled in with the evening, turning the familiar landscape strange and otherworldly. Trees loomed out of the darkness like sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the sky. The road was empty, of course it was empty. Who else would be out at this hour? And the only sound was the engine and the occasional ping of gravel against the undercarriage. 5 minutes passed. 10. What if it's about the children? Kate's voice was small, tight. What if something happened and they didn't want to tell us over the phone? It's not about the children. William's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The call came from the palace, from his office. If it were George or Charlotte or Louis, we'd have heard differently. Then what? It's him. The words came out with a certainty he didn't want to feel. It's my father. I can feel it. He'd lived this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. The call about Philip had come in the early morning, not late at night, but it had carried the same weight, the same careful formality that meant something irreversible had happened or was about to happen. And before that, Diana, though, that had been different, chaotic. The news breaking before anyone official could call, the world ending in a Paris tunnel while he slept in a Scottish castle. But this felt like Philip. This felt like death keeping appointments, making arrangements, allowing for goodbyes. He's been well, Kate said, but her voice wavered on the last word. The last we saw him, he was well. Tired, maybe. But when have they ever told us the truth about these things? Until they had to. She didn't answer, because they both knew he was right. The palace machinery ran on secrets and selective disclosure, on protecting the institution, even when protection meant keeping the family in the dark. How many times had they learned about a crisis only after it had been managed, sanitized, repackaged for public consumption? William's eyes burned. He blinked hard, focusing on the road. Up ahead, through the thinning fog, he could see lights. Windsor Castle rose against the night sky, its medieval towers and turrets illuminated like a stage set. But not all of it was lit. Most of the castle was dark, vast sections of it sleeping or simply unused. Only one wing blazed with light, every window glowing. The king's private apartments. Look, Kate whispered. She'd seen it too. They both stared at that single lit section of the massive fortress, and William felt his stomach drop. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't a working evening or late-night paperwork. This was vigil lighting, the kind of illumination that meant someone was awake who shouldn't be. Someone was needed who would rather be sleeping. Someone was dying, or making decisions about dying. William pulled the car over. He didn't mean to. One moment he was driving, the next his foot had hit the brake and they were stopped on the shoulder of the road, the castle visible in the distance, and he couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, compressed, as though someone had wrapped bands around his ribs and was slowly tightening them. William, I can't. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. I can't do this. Not again. Not another funeral. Another mourning period. Another. He couldn't finish. Couldn't name what he was really afraid of. Another crown. Because that's what this meant, didn't it? If his father was dying, if that's what waited for them in those lit windows, then everything changed. The careful buffer they'd built around their family, the years they'd thought they had before succession became reality. Instead of distant theory, all of it would vanish. George was 10 years old, the same age William had been when his mother died. And now he'd have to start learning about duty and sacrifice and all the things that made childhood impossible. He felt Kate's hand on his shoulder, warm and steady. "We face it together," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, whatever's waiting for us in there, we don't do it alone. We've never done it alone." He turned to look at her. In the darkness of the car, with only the dashboard lights illuminating her face, she looked impossibly young and impossibly tired all at once. She was afraid he could see it in her eyes, but she wasn't running. She never ran. "What if I'm not ready?" His voice cracked. "What if none of us are ready? Then we'll be unready together." She managed a small smile. "Come on. They're waiting." He took a breath, then another. Then he put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. And they covered the last mile to Windsor Castle in silence. The aide who met them at the entrance was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of carefully blank expression that came from years of training in discretion. He didn't offer condolences or explanations, just a slight bow and a murmured, "Your Royal Highnesses," before turning to lead them inside. The castle swallowed them. William had been in Windsor 1,000 times, had grown up running through these corridors, hiding in alcoves, playing at being a knight in armor beneath the watchful eyes of ancestral portraits. But tonight it felt different. The stone walls seemed to lean in closer, the ceilings pressed down heavier. His footsteps echoed too loudly on the ancient floors, each impact a reminder that he was walking where kings had walked, where his father had walked just hours ago, where his son would walk someday. The portraits watched them pass. Elizabeth I with her pearls and her power. George III with his madness barely hidden behind painted eyes. Victoria in her eternal mourning. They'd all done this, he thought. They'd all received the news that changed everything. Had all walked these halls knowing what came next. The smell hit him next: old wood and beeswax polish, the particular scent of a building that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. Stone and history and the accumulated weight of centuries pressing down, making it hard to breathe, hard to think of anything but legacy and duty and the inescapable machinery of succession. Kate's fingers found his. She laced them together without looking at him, and he held on, like she was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain. They passed staff members who pressed themselves against the walls, heads bowed, eyes averted. No one met their gaze. That alone told William everything he needed to know about what waited ahead. You didn't avoid looking at people who were about to receive good news. A clock somewhere chimed midnight. 12 deep resonant tones that marked the ending of a day, the beginning of another. William counted each one, using them to steady his breathing, to push back the panic rising in his throat. The aide stopped before a door William knew well: his father's private sitting room, the one he used when he didn't want the formality of staterooms, when he wanted to be Charles instead of king, or as close to Charles as a king could ever be. "His Majesty asked that you wait here," the aide said. "He'll be with you shortly." Then the young man was gone, footsteps receding down the corridor, and William and Kate were alone. The sitting room was ornate but somehow cold, despite the fire burning in the grate. Gilded furniture, silk wallpaper, paintings, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Kate moved to the fireplace, holding her hands out to the flames, though William didn't think she was really cold. Just needed something to do, somewhere to look that wasn't the closed door or his face. He checked his watch. Nearly midnight now. The children would be deeply asleep, sprawled in their beds with that boneless abandon only children managed. George probably had a book hidden under his pillow, planning to read by torchlight when he thought no one would check. Charlotte would be tangled in her sheets, one leg hanging off the bed. Louis would be starfished across. His mattress, having kicked off his duvet entirely. They had no idea their world was about to change. 5 minutes passed. William counted them, watching the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Kate had stopped pretending to warm her hands and was just standing there, staring at the flames, her jaw tight. Then they heard footsteps. Not the aide's quick professional pace. These were slower, heavier, hesitant. The footsteps of someone who didn't want to reach their destination. The door opened. Charles stood in the doorway, and William forgot how to breathe. His father looked old. Not the carefully maintained, vigorous for his age, older man of official photographs, but genuinely, terribly old. His shoulders slumped, as though carrying impossible weight. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from crying or exhaustion or both. William couldn't tell. He wore casual clothes, a sweater, trousers, slippers, and somehow that was worse than if he'd been in full regalia. This was Charles, just Charles. A father who had to tell his son something unbearable. "I'm sorry to call you so late," Charles said, and his voice shook. "There wasn't. I couldn't wait." Kate's breath caught audibly. William felt his body go rigid, every muscle locking. Charles stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and in that moment, before any words could be spoken, William knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. His father's face told him everything. The vigil had begun. Charles led them deeper into his private apartments, past the sitting room where protocol would have them gather, past the formal spaces designed for audiences and consultations. He took them to his study, the book-lined sanctuary, where William had been summoned only a handful of times in his life, usually for conversations about divorce or duty, or other words that started with D and ended in devastation. The fire was dying in the grate, collapsing into embers that cast restless shadows across the spines of leather-bound books. Philosophy, history, architecture, organic farming. His father's eclectic interests crammed onto shelves that reached the ceiling. The room smelled of old paper and wood smoke and something else, something medicinal that William couldn't quite place. Charles gestured to the chairs arranged before the fireplace, but he didn't sit. He stood with his back to them, one hand gripping the mantelpiece, his shoulders rising and falling with careful breaths. "I saw the doctors 3 weeks ago," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "A routine check? Or what I thought was routine. I'd been tired, more than usual, but I'm 76. Tiredness seemed." He trailed off. "They found something. Several somethings." William felt Kate's hand find his knee, squeezing hard enough to hurt. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His entire body had gone numb, except for that point of pressure where her fingers dug into his leg. "Pancreatic cancer," Charles continued, still not turning around. "Stage 4. Aggressive. Already metastasized to the liver, the lungs." His voice remained eerily steady, as though he were reading a weather report instead of his own death sentence. They used words like palliative and comfortable, quality of life, making the most of the time remaining. The words hit William like physical blows. Stage 4. Palliative. Time remaining. How long? Kate's voice cut through the silence, practical and gentle all at once. She was the only one capable of speech, apparently, the only one whose throat hadn't closed entirely. Charles finally turned. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, as though he couldn't quite bear to look directly at them. Months. 6, perhaps. Maybe less. Maybe slightly more if the treatment. He laughed. A bitter sound. Treatment. As if there's anything to treat at this stage. We're managing symptoms now. Pain. Nausea. The indignity of a body failing piece by piece. What about Kate's voice? Wavered. What about Camilla? Does she know? She knows. She was with me when they explained. Charles moved to the chair opposite them, lowering himself carefully, as though his bones might shatter. She's been remarkable, but terrified. We've been married such a short time, and now he couldn't finish. William still couldn't speak. His mind had fractured into 1,000 pieces, each one screaming different things. This isn't real. This can't be happening. Not now. Not when we just lost Gongon. Not when the children are so young. Not when I'm not ready. Never ready. Would he ever have been ready? There will be treatment, Kate pressed, and William loved her for it. For being able to think past the immediate shock to practical questions, to the things that needed knowing. Chemo? Radiation? Something? Palliative chemotherapy. To slow things down, buy time. Charles's hands trembled in his lap. But the oncologist was clear. We're not talking about a cure. We're talking about weeks, maybe a month or two, and the side effects. He closed his eyes. I thought I'd have more time, to be king, to do the work I'd spent my entire life preparing for. 74 years waiting, and 18 months wearing the crown. That's what I get. 18 months. Papa, the word slipped out before William could stop it. The childhood name he hadn't used in decades. It broke something in his chest. That word made it impossible to maintain the distance he'd been desperately trying to construct between himself and this moment. Charles looked at him fully for the first time since they'd entered the room. Really looked at him, and William saw his father's face crumple. I'm sorry, Charles whispered. I'm so sorry, William. For all of it. For the timing. For leaving you with this burden. For his voice broke. For not being a better father when I had the chance. William was out of his chair before he realized he was moving. He dropped to his knees in front of his father. And when Charles reached for him, when those aging, trembling hands found his face, he couldn't hold back anymore. He gripped his father's wrists and held on like he was 13 years old, and his mother had just died, and the world had ended for the first time. You can't, William said, and his voice sounded destroyed even to his own ears. You can't leave, not now. Not like this. I don't have a choice, darling boy. Charles's thumbs brushed William's cheeks, and William realized he was crying without having felt the tears start. None of us do. This is the one thing even kings can't command. They stayed like that, father and son, while the fire died lower, and Kate wept silently in her chair. There were no words adequate to this. No protocol for the moment when you learned your father was dying, and you were about to become king, and your children were about to lose their grandfather, and the entire machinery of succession was about to grind forward, whether you were ready or not. Finally, Charles spoke again, his voice raw. George, he's so young, too young, just like you were. His hands tightened on William's face. Promise me you'll protect him. Don't let them rush him into duty. Don't let the palace machinery chew him up the way it did you, the way it did me. I'm not ready, William said desperately. None of us are ready. George is 10 years old. He should be worried about football and homework and whether Charlotte's going to steal his dessert. Not, he couldn't say it. Couldn't say the word succession or crown or any of it. You'll never be ready. Charles pulled William's forehead to his own, and they breathed the same air for a moment. I waited my entire life, and I still wasn't ready. But you have something I never did. You have Catherine. Kate made a sound, half sob, half laugh. William felt her hand on his shoulder, and he turned his head to see her standing beside them, tears streaming down her face. We'll face it together, she said, echoing the words she'd spoken in the car. All of it, however it comes. Charles released William and reached for Kate's hand, pulling her down to sit on the arm of his chair. He held both their hands, and for a moment they were just three people bound by blood and marriage and love. Not royal figures in a 1,000-year-old institution. Don't let the crown swallow them whole, Charles said fiercely. Promise me, George, Charlotte, Louis, they deserve childhoods. They deserve to be loved more than they're useful. Promise me, William. I promise, William managed. I swear it. Kate excused herself 5 minutes later, mumbling something about needing the bathroom. Her voice was steady, her face composed, but William saw the way her hands shook as she stood. She found the powder room adjacent to the study and locked the door behind her with careful precision. Then she leaned back against it, slid down to sit on the cold tile floor, and let herself break. The tears came silently, years of training preventing her from making noise even now, even in private. She wrapped her arms around her knees and pressed her face against them and cried the way she'd been holding back for 20 minutes, for the entire drive to Windsor, for every moment since William's phone had rung and split their world in two. She kept seeing the children's faces. George, too perceptive for his own good, who would understand exactly what this meant. Charlotte, tender-hearted, who would cry for days. Louis, barely 7, who wouldn't understand at all. Not really. Not until it was too late. And she kept seeing her own face in the bathroom mirror of her hospital room 17 months ago, when they'd told her about the cancer. The fear in her own eyes. The way William had held her while she sobbed and asked how they'd tell the children, what they'd say if the treatment didn't work, how George would cope with losing another mother. She'd survived, but the fear never quite left. And now they had to do it again, had to sit their children down and explain that someone they loved was dying, that death was coming for their family again, that nothing was certain and nothing was safe, and all you could do was love each other while you had time. Kate pressed her palms against the cold tile and tried to steady her breathing. She was the Princess of Wales. She'd stood beside William through scandal and loss and the relentless scrutiny of a world that wanted to see them fail. She could do this. She had to do this. She pulled herself up, turned on the tap, splashed cold water on her face. In the ornate mirror, gilt-framed, probably worth more than her childhood home, her reflection looked haggard. Mascara smudged beneath her eyes, face blotchy from crying, hair escaping its ponytail in wisps. She cleaned her face methodically, finger-combing her hair back into place. The physical actions helped, grounded her, reminded her that she had a body, had hands that worked, had a life to return to beyond this grief-struck moment. By the time she unlocked the door and returned to the study, she'd rebuilt her composure, shoulders back, face smooth, tears contained. William saw through it immediately. His eyes met hers across the room, and she watched his expression soften with understanding. He didn't say anything. Charles was speaking, making plans, shifting into king mode. But William's hand reached out to her as she took her seat, and she held it like a lifeline. The conversation shifted. Charles straightened in his chair, and William recognized the transformation he'd witnessed 1,000 times, his father becoming king. Duty overriding emotion, the machinery of monarchy grinding into motion. "We'll need to manage this carefully," Charles said, his voice steadier now. "The medical updates, the public statements, the transition planning." Transition planning. William tasted the words, bitter and inevitable. "You mean succession?" "I mean ensuring continuity. For the country. For the Commonwealth." Charles' eyes were dry now, focused. "We'll need to brief the Prime Minister, the Archbishop, the Commonwealth heads. Constitutional requirements for regency if I become incapacitated before." He stopped. "Before? How public will this be?" William leaned forward, his mind finally engaging with the practical realities. "What do we tell the children? When?" "Soon." Charles looked at him steadily. "They'll hear it from you, or they'll hear it from school friends who've seen it online. Better it comes from you." Kate spoke up, her voice controlled. "George has a French test on Tuesday. Charlotte has ballet on Wednesday. Louis has his school nativity play rehearsal." She paused. "We'll need to maintain their routines as much as possible. They'll need stability when everything else is falling apart." Charles nodded. "Yes, exactly. Their lives continue. They're not chips in a royal game, they're children." His voice roughened. "But George, we'll need to begin preparing him. Gently, slowly. But he needs to understand what's coming." "He's 10, William said flatly. "You were 15 when you lost your mother. You had no preparation, no warning. At least George can be readied." "Readied?" William's voice rose. "He's a child. He should be playing video games and arguing with his siblings, not preparing to be king in training. He won't be king for decades, but he'll be heir. First in line. Under scrutiny, under pressure, with photographers following him everywhere and the world watching for him to fail." William was standing now, pacing. You know what that does. We all know what that does. Charles was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, I want to spend time with them, however long I have. I want them to remember me as Grandpa, not just as the king who died. Real time. Not state occasions or official visits. Just time. The simplicity of it broke through William's anger. His father wanted what every dying man wanted: time with the people he loved. The chance to make memories that would outlast him. They'll remember you, William said, his voice thick. I promise. Not as king. As Grandpa. As the man who taught George about organic farming and let Charlotte pick flowers from the garden and read stories to Louis. Last Christmas, Charles said quietly. Last birthday. Last everything. He looked into the fire. How do you choose what to do with your last months when you know they're your last? No one had an answer. An aide knocked softly, entered, began speaking about schedules and briefings and constitutional requirements. The palace machinery, grinding forward. Charles listened, nodded, gave instructions. William watched his father become king again, donning duty like armor against the fear. Kate touched William's arm, drawing his attention. When he looked at her, she mouthed, "Tonight." He understood. Tonight, they were being asked to plan the end of a reign, the beginning of another. Tonight, they were supposed to think about regency protocols and constitutional requirements. But tonight, Kate's voice cut through the aide's recitation. Everyone turned to look at her. Tonight we're just a family. Can we have that, please? Charles looked at her for a long moment, then at William, then at the aide. Leave us, he said quietly. All of you. Tell anyone who's waiting that we're not to be disturbed. The aide bowed and withdrew. The door closed. Charles stood, moved to a cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He poured 3 glasses, not the ceremonial crystal for state occasions, but everyday tumblers, the kind you'd use at home. He handed them out silently, then raised his own. To family, he said simply. To time, Kate added. To love, William finished. They drank. Then they sat, the 3 of them, in the dying firelight. Not king and heir and princess, just Charles and William and Catherine. A father dying, a son grieving, a daughter-in-law holding them, both together. Outside, Windsor Castle stood silent. Inside, 3 people sat with their grief and their fear and their love, stealing these hours together before the machinery of monarchy consumed them all. The fire burned down to ash. Nobody moved to stoke it. They left Windsor as the sky was beginning to lighten. That strange, in-between hour, when night hadn't quite released its grip, but dawn was already claiming the horizon. The castle receded in the rearview mirror, its towers and turrets gradually swallowed by distance and the lingering fog that clung to the Thames Valley. William drove. Kate sat beside him. Neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Exactly, they'd been married long enough to know that not all silences needed filling. But this one felt heavy, weighted with everything they'd learned, and everything they'd have to do with that knowledge. The road unwound before them, empty and gray, and William kept his eyes fixed on the white line marking the edge, using it to anchor himself when his thoughts threatened to spiral. 10 minutes passed. 15. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. Without warning, he pulled over. The car lurched onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires. William threw it into park and sat there, both hands locked on the wheel, breathing in ragged gasps that he couldn't quite control. His chest felt too tight, his lungs too small, like someone had replaced his ribcage with something smaller, harder, unyielding. William. He couldn't answer, couldn't look at her. He just sat there, staring through the windscreen, at the empty road ahead, at the fields spreading out on either side into the growing light, and tried to remember how to breathe like a normal person, instead of someone drowning on dry land. Kate's hand found his shoulder, not grabbing, not shaking, just resting there, warm and solid and real. I keep thinking about Mum, he said finally, the words coming out strangled. How fast it happened. One moment she was there, and then she wasn't. And I had no time to prepare, no time to say goodbye, no time for anything except the phone ringing and my whole world ending. He swallowed hard. And now it's happening again. Except this time I have months to watch it happen. Months to prepare. Which is worse, knowing or not knowing? Having time or having none? You are not 13 anymore, Kate said quietly. Her thumb moved in small circles against his shoulder blade, the kind of unconscious comfort gesture she'd probably picked up from soothing children's nightmares. And you're not alone. You're not facing this with stiff upper lip and royal protocol, and no one acknowledging what you're actually feeling. What do we tell them? He turned to look at her finally, and the pre-dawn light made her face look ethereal and exhausted all at once. What do we tell our children about death and duty, and their grandfather dying, and their father becoming king, and George having to... He couldn't finish. What do we say? Kate was quiet for a moment, her hand still on his shoulder. Then, the truth. Age-appropriate, but the truth. We tell them Grandpa is very sick. We tell them he won't get better. We tell them we'll visit him as much as we can, that they'll have time with him, that it's okay to be sad, and scared, and angry. What if George asks about after? William's voice cracked on the word. What if he asks what happens when Papa dies? What happens to us? To him? Then we tell him we'll face it together. All of us. Kate's hand tightened on his shoulder. We don't have all the answers, William. We can't promise them it won't hurt, or that everything will be fine. But we can promise them they're not alone. That's what we can give them. Something in William's chest finally cracked open. Not dramatically, no sobbing, no wailing. Nothing that would make headlines if someone photographed them through the car window. Just quiet tears. The kind that came from a place too deep for noise, sliding down his face while he sat perfectly still. Kate shifted in her seat, unbuckled her seatbelt, and reached for him. In the awkward confines of the car, with the console between them and the steering wheel in the way, she managed to pull his head to her shoulder and hold him there. Her fingers threaded through his hair, and she didn't say anything, didn't try to make it better, just let him break in the small, private space they'd carved out on the side of a country road. Outside, the sun continued its inexorable rise. Light spilled across the fields, turning the frost on the grass into diamonds, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day, whether they were ready for it or not. Eventually, William's breathing steadied. He sat up, wiped his face with his palms, and managed something like a smile. Sorry. Don't, Kate said firmly. Don't apologize for being human. They sat in silence as the light grew stronger, filling the car with soft illumination. Then William put the car in drive, checked for traffic that didn't exist, and pulled back onto the road. They drove home. Adelaide Cottage looked exactly as they'd left it, which felt wrong, somehow. Shouldn't the world look different when everything had changed? But there were the same familiar walls, the same gravel drive, the same security gate that opened at their approach, the same shoes scattered in the hallway when they let themselves in, the same breakfast dishes still sitting on the kitchen counter from yesterday morning, the same children's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. Normal. Everything was devastatingly, impossibly normal. Upstairs, the house was silent. The children were still sleeping, their 7 a.m. wake-up call still an hour away. William checked his watch, 6:15. They'd been gone for 7 hours. It felt like 7 years. Kate moved to the kitchen on autopilot, filling the kettle, pulling out mugs. William knew she didn't actually want tea. Neither of them did. But the ritual of it gave her something to do with her hands, some way to impose order on a morning that felt fundamentally disordered. He stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden. Someone had left a football on the lawn. George's, probably, abandoned mid-game when they'd been called in for dinner. The climbing frame stood empty, the swings hanging motionless in the still morning air. In a few hours, this space would be full of noise and chaos and life. Right now, it waited. The kettle clicked off. Kate poured water over tea bags neither of them would drink, then brought both mugs to the kitchen table and sat down. After a moment, William joined her. This table had been the site of so many ordinary moments: homework battles, breakfast negotiations, Sunday morning pancakes where they all got flour in their hair, the heart of their home. Now they sat at it with cups of tea they didn't want, and tried to figure out how to tell their children that death was coming. "Today," William said finally. "We tell them today. Before school." Kate nodded. "After breakfast, maybe. When they're awake enough to understand, but before they're dressed and ready to leave. We tell them Grandpa is sick," William continued, working through it out loud. "Very sick. That the doctors are helping him be comfortable, but he won't get better. We tell them they can visit him as much as they want," Kate added. "That he wants to spend time with them. That it's important to make happy memories now." "What do we shield them from?" William asked. "The timeline? The fact that he has months, not years?" "Charlotte will cry," Kate said softly. "She'll cry, and we'll hold her until she can't cry anymore. George will ask questions we can't answer, or questions we can answer but wish we couldn't. Louis won't really understand. Not yet. Maybe not until it happens." "We don't hide," William said, more to himself than to her. "We never hide from them. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Kate reached across the table and took his hand. "We tell them the truth. And we tell them we love them. And we tell them it's going to hurt, but we'll get through it together." A sound from upstairs, small feet hitting the floor, the creak of a door opening. Louis? Almost certainly. He was always the first one up, padding downstairs in his pajamas, to see if anyone would play with him before his siblings woke. William and Kate looked at each other across the kitchen table. A whole conversation happened in that glance. Are we ready? No. Do we have a choice? No. Can we do this? We have to. Kate squeezed his hand once, then released it. She stood, smoothing her hair, preparing herself. William followed suit, and together they moved to the doorway just as Louis appeared at the bottom of the stairs, dragging his stuffed lion behind him. "Mama?" Louis rubbed his eyes with one small fist, looking confused. "Papa? Why does everyone look sad?" William knelt down, bringing himself to his youngest son's eye level. Behind Louis, he could hear stirring upstairs George's door opening, Charlotte's voice calling out. In a moment, they'd all be down here, and there would be no more putting it off. "Come here, darling," William said, opening his arms. Louis shuffled forward, still clutching his lion, and William pulled him close. "Go wake your brother and sister, okay? We need to talk to all of you about something important." 20 minutes later, they were all assembled in the living room. George and Charlotte on the sofa, still in pajamas, hair uncombed. Louis on the floor between William and Kate, his lion clutched in both hands. Morning light streamed through the windows, achingly beautiful and utterly wrong for the conversation they were about to have. George was watching them with that too-old expression he sometimes wore, the one that reminded William uncomfortably of himself at that age. He already knew something was wrong. He'd seen them leave last night, had probably heard the car return in the early morning, had definitely noticed the tension radiating off both his parents. "Is someone dead?" George asked bluntly. "George?" Kate started. "No," William said. "No one's dead, but someone is very sick. Grandpa Charles is very sick." Charlotte's face crumpled immediately. Kate pulled her close, and William watched his daughter bury her face in her mother's shoulder and start to cry the simple, uncomplicated grief of an 8-year-old who loved her grandfather and couldn't bear the thought of him hurting. Louis looked between his siblings and his parents, confused. "Sick like when I had a cold?" "Sicker than that," Kate said gently, one hand stroking Charlotte's hair. "Much sicker. The kind of sick where the doctors can't make it better, only help him feel more comfortable." "Is he going to die?" George's voice was flat, matter of fact, the directness of childhood, before you learn to talk around difficult things. William felt Kate's eyes on him, and he took a breath. "Yes," he said, because they'd agreed on honesty, even when honesty hurt. Yes, someday. We all die. Someday. But right now, Grandpa is still here, and he very much wants to spend time with all of you. He wants to have fun with you, and talk to you, and make happy memories. That's what matters right now. Can we bring him biscuits? Louis asked suddenly, earnestly. When I'm sad, biscuits make me feel better. Maybe biscuits would help Grandpa too. The simplicity of it, the pure, perfect logic of a 7-year-old, made William smile despite everything. He reached out and ruffled Louis's hair. I think Grandpa would love that very much. George was still watching him with that intense, analytical gaze. Does this mean? He paused, choosing his words carefully. Does this mean you'll be king soon? The weight of the question settled over the room like a physical presence. Even Charlotte stopped crying, lifting her head to look at her father. Louis tilted his head, not quite understanding but sensing this was important. William and Kate looked at each other. Another one of those silent conversations. How much do we say? How much is fair to put on a 10-year-old? How do we prepare him without stealing his childhood? Someday, William said finally. Yes, someday I'll be king, but not today. Not tomorrow. Not for a while. Today, I'm just your dad. And Grandpa Charles is still king. And right now, what matters most is that we spend time together as a family, all of us. Will I have to? George's voice got very small. Will I have to do king things? Someday? Someday, William acknowledged. But you're 10 years old, George. Right now, you have to do 10-year-old things. School. Football. Annoying your sister. That got a tiny smile. When you're older, we'll talk about the other things. But that's a long time from now. And no matter what happens, Kate added, pulling all 3 children close, we stay together. Always. As a family. Nothing changes that. Not crowns, not duty, not anything. Charlotte was crying again, but softer now. Louis was playing with his lion's mane, processing in his own way. George sat very still, very quiet, thinking too hard for a child his age. William reached out and pulled George to him, holding his eldest son tight. I've got you, he whispered. Whatever comes, I've got you. They sat like that, all 5 of them, as morning light filled the room. Outside, the world was waking up, birds calling, distant traffic, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day. Inside, a family held each other and tried to prepare for a future none of them wanted, but together. Always together. 2 days later, they returned to Windsor with all 3 children. The car ride was different this time, nervous energy instead of dread, though the 2 weren't entirely unrelated. George sat by the window, quiet and tense, watching the countryside roll past. Charlotte clutched Kate's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Louis, wedged between his siblings, asked questions in an endless stream. Will Grandpa look different? Can we play with him? Is he too sick to laugh? What if he's sleeping? Should we whisper? Kate answered each one with patient gentleness. But William caught her eyes in the rearview mirror and saw his own anxiety reflected back. They were bringing their children to say hello to their dying grandfather. There was no handbook for this, no protocol that made it easier. Charles was waiting for them in a sitting room, not the formal study this time, but a smaller, warmer space with sofas arranged around a fireplace. He looked frailer than he had 3 days ago, his sweater hanging loose on shoulders that seemed to have narrowed, but he was smiling. That smile, William thought, must have cost him everything. Louis didn't hesitate. The moment they entered, he broke free from Kate's hand and ran straight to Charles, throwing himself into his grandfather's lap with the absolute trust of a child who didn't yet understand that bodies could be fragile things. Careful, William started. But Charles was already wrapping his arms around Louis, holding him close, his eyes squeezed shut. Hello, my darling boy, Charles murmured into Louis's hair. George hung back near the doorway, and Charlotte pressed herself against Kate's side. They were old enough to see what Louis couldn't, the pallor, the careful way Charles moved, the effort behind every gesture. Come, Charles said, looking at them over Louis's head. Come sit with me. Tell me everything. How's school? Are you still beating everyone at football, George? Charlotte, did you finish that painting you were working on? Slowly, tentatively, they came. Charlotte perched on the arm of Charles's chair, still holding Kate's hand. George sat on the ottoman, close but not quite touching. And Charles talked to them, really talked. About ordinary things. Mundane things. The kind of conversation that said, "You are children, and I am your grandfather, and right now that's all that matters." William stood back, watching. Kate had pulled out her phone and was taking photos, quiet and unobtrusive. Not official photographs for the archive, just moments. Their moments. Charles laughing at something Louis said. Charlotte finally relaxing enough to lean against her grandfather's shoulder. George's serious face softening into something almost like peace. William tried to memorize it all the way. Afternoon light fell across his father's face, the sound of the children's laughter, the particular quality of love in a room where everyone knew time was running out. These were the images he'd need later, the ones that would matter when the state photographs and official portraits felt too distant, too formal to touch the ache of missing. After 20 minutes, Charles touched George's shoulder. "Could I have a word with you? Just us?" George glanced at William, who nodded. They disappeared into an adjacent room, and William stood outside the closed door, not eavesdropping exactly, but listening to the low murmur of voices, his father's rough and gentle, his son's higher, uncertain. He couldn't hear the words, but he imagined them. Charles would be talking about legacy, probably, but framing it the way George could understand. Being kind matters more than being powerful. Taking care of people is what makes a good king. And George would be asking the questions William wished he wouldn't have to ask. Does it hurt? Are you scared? And Charles would answer with honesty tempered by love. Only sometimes. Not when I'm with all of you. When they emerged, George's eyes were red but his face was calm. He went straight to William and leaned against him, and William wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders and held on. Charlotte approached Charles shyly, holding something behind her back. "I made you something," she said, and produced a drawing, all of them together, stick figures holding hands, and Charles in the middle wearing a crown made of yellow crayon. Charles took it with trembling hands. His eyes filled, and he didn't bother wiping the tears away. "It's perfect," he whispered. "It's absolutely perfect. I'll hang it right beside my bed, so I can see it every day." Then Louis, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a child, offered his stuffed lion. "You can keep him," he said seriously. "For when you're scared at night, he helps me feel brave." Charles pulled all three children close then, and William saw his father's face crumple with the kind of grief and love that had no adequate expression. "Thank you," Charles managed. "Thank you all." Leaving was harder than arriving. The children didn't want to go, kept turning back for one more hug, one more moment. Charlotte cried quietly. George's jaw was set in that way that meant he was fighting tears. Even Louis's chatter had gone silent. "We'll come back," William promised, crouching down to their level in the hallway. "Lots, as often as we can, I promise." 1 month later, William's phone rang at 10 p.m. Not an aide this time. Camilla. Her voice was wrecked, barely recognizable. "William, you should come. Tonight. She couldn't finish. "It's time." No discussion. No processing. Just movement. William and Kate were in the car within minutes, leaving behind 3 sleeping children and hastily summoned staff and tearful goodbyes to security who knew exactly what this meant. The drive was faster this time. Urgent in a way the first one hadn't been. William's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, and Kate sat rigid beside him, her phone clutched in both hands, though she wasn't looking at it. There were no words for this. Nothing to say that would make any difference. Windsor looked different. More cars lined the drive, more staff moving with quiet purpose through the lit corridors. The hushed voices of vigil, of ending, of the machinery of monarchy, preparing for transition. The corridor to Charles's bedroom felt longer than William remembered, each step heavier. Kate's hand in his was the only thing keeping him moving forward. They reached the door, just as Camilla emerged. Her face was ravaged, aged a decade in a month. Her eyes met William's, and he saw everything he needed to know. "He's asking for you," she whispered. "Both of you. He's been waiting." William stood frozen for 1 second, just one, in which every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to walk away, to refuse this moment that would cleave his life into before and after. But Kate's hand tightened in his, and he remembered his promise. Together, he pushed open the door. Charles lay in bed, so small somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the monitors or the IV lines or the oxygen. The room was dim, quiet except for the steady beep of machines. Medical staff stepped back, giving them space, and William and Kate moved to either side of the bed. Charles's eyes opened. "Found William. Found Kate. You came," he breathed. "Always," William said, and took his father's hand. The vigil began. The hours passed in that strange compression of time that happens in hospital rooms and deathbeds, where minutes stretch into eternities and whole hours vanish without notice. Night deepened toward that darkest point just before dawn, and in Charles' bedroom, 3 people kept vigil. Kate held Charles's hand, her thumb moving in slow, unconscious circles across his papery skin. William sat on the other side, a book open in his lap, one of his father's favorites, passages about gardens and growing things, about the patient work of cultivation. His voice was steady as he read, even when the words blurred and he had to pause to clear his throat. Charles' breathing had grown shallow, irregular. The spaces between breaths stretched longer each time, and William found himself holding his own breath, waiting, counting the seconds, until his father inhaled again. He read memories, too, when the book felt inadequate. "Remember when you took us to Balmoral and I fell in the stream? You jumped right in after me, full uniform and all. Granny was furious about the state of your boots." A pause. "You laughed the whole way back to the castle. Said it was worth it to see her face." A small sound from Charles, not quite a laugh, but close enough. His eyes remained closed, but his fingers tightened fractionally around Kate's hand. William kept reading, kept talking, kept filling the silence with words, because silence felt too much like absence, and his father was still here, still breathing, still holding on. "George asked me yesterday if you'd taught me to fish," William said, setting the book aside. "I told him yes. I told him you were terrible at it, that you spent more time talking about the philosophy of fishing than actually catching anything, but that it didn't matter, that those mornings on the river were," his voice cracked, "that they were perfect, proud." The word was barely audible, more breath than sound. Charles's eyes opened, just slightly, unfocused but searching. "Proud of you, both." Kate leaned closer, her free hand coming up to touch Charles's face. "We know," she whispered. "We know. Tell the children." Charles struggled for breath, for words. "Tell them." They waited. William leaned forward, willing his father to finish, to give them that last message, that final piece of wisdom to carry forward. But Charles's eyes had closed again, and his chest rose and fell with increasing effort, and the words, whatever they would have been, remained unspoken. Then, so quietly William almost missed it, Charles's breathing changed. Kate felt it first. Her hand stilled, and she looked up at William with stricken eyes. Charles's chest rose once more, held, then slowly fell. The monitors began to change their rhythm, their tone shifting from steady to urgent, to something that sounded too much like ending. William couldn't move. He sat frozen, staring at his father's face, at the still chest that wasn't rising anymore, at the hand that had gone slack in Kate's grip. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Any moment now, Charles would take another breath, would open his eyes, would prove that death was still waiting, still something that belonged to the future instead of now. Kate's hand moved with terrible gentleness. She reached up and closed Charles's eyes, the gesture so intimate, so final, that William felt something crack deep in his chest. She'd done this before, he realized. In her work with hospices, with dying patients, she'd learned this ritual, this last kindness. A doctor stepped forward. William hadn't even registered. There were still medical staff in the room, and checked for a pulse, for breathing, for all the clinical signs that would confirm what they already knew. He looked at his watch. Time of death, 4:47 a.m. The words hung in the air, making it real, making it permanent. The king was dead. William's body folded inward. Not a dramatic collapse, nothing theatrical or suited for cameras. Just a quiet crumpling, his head dropping into his hands, his shoulders curving around the hollow space where his father used to be. He didn't sob, didn't wail, just sat there with his face hidden and his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Kate's arm came around him. Her own face was wet with silent tears. But she held him anyway. Held him while the medical staff quietly disconnected monitors and gathered equipment and performed all the necessary rituals of death in a palace. They sat like that for a long time, minutes or hours, William couldn't have said. Eventually, someone touched his shoulder gently, murmuring about procedures, about what needed to happen next, about the machinery of monarchy that never stopped, not even for grief. William stood. His legs felt uncertain beneath him, but he stood. Kate rose with him, and together they walked to the door, leaving Charles behind, no longer Charles, now just a body, just the thing that was left when the person departed. The corridor outside was lined with staff. They stood in 2 rows, heads bowed, silent. As William and Kate emerged, they bowed lower, a wave of motion rippling down the hallway. And then someone, an equerry, maybe, or a senior aide, spoke the words that changed everything. "Your Majesty." William flinched. Actually flinched, as though the title were a physical blow. He wasn't ready for those words. Wouldn't be ready if he lived 1,000 years. But they'd been spoken, and there was no taking them back. No pretending he was still just the Prince of Wales, still just William, still just a son mourning his father. He was the king now, whether he wanted it or not. They walked down the corridor, through the palace that was his now, past staff who would serve him now, carrying grief and duty in equal measure. Kate's hand in his was the only thing that felt real. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cold, sharp, clearing some of the fog from William's mind. Their car waited on the drive, and they moved toward it in silence. Behind them, the palace lights began to go out, not all at once, but section by section, window by window. The king's private apartments going dark, the official lights extinguishing in careful sequence. William heard someone murmur, another aide. Someone managing logistics. "Protocol, sir. The king's residence is closed." Kate stopped walking. She turned, and William turned with her, and they stood in the darkness, watching Windsor Castle gradually surrender to night. The lights went out in waves, like a tide receding. First the upper floors, then the staterooms, then the ground floor apartments. Section by section, the castle that had blazed with light when they arrived now returned to darkness, until only a few scattered windows remained glowing. Kate made a sound, so quiet William almost didn't hear it. He looked at her, and she was staring at the castle, at the darkness spreading across its ancient walls, her face unreadable in the dim light. "It's over," she whispered. Not to him, not to anyone, just to the night, to the darkness, to the moment that contained everything: Charles's death, their old life, the future they'd imagined, the possibility of ever feeling normal again. "It's over." William didn't speak, couldn't speak. He just reached for her hand and held it. And together they stood watching as the last lights went out, plunging Windsor Castle into complete darkness. 2 figures on a drive in the pre-dawn cold, watching the end of an era. Finally, William turned. Kate turned with him. They walked to the car, got in, and William started the engine. As they pulled away, he glanced in the rear-view mirror one last time. The castle was invisible now, swallowed by darkness and distance, as though it had never been lit at all. They drove home in silence. The sun was just beginning to lighten the horizon when they pulled up to Adelaide Cottage. The house was dark, quiet. Inside, 3 children slept, still safe in their dreams, still living in a world where their grandfather was alive and their father was not yet king. William and Kate sat in the car for a moment, neither moving to get out. Soon they'd have to go inside. Soon they'd have to wake their children and find the words to explain death and change and all the impossible things that had happened while they slept. Soon the palace would release a statement, and the world would know, and everything would become official and irreversible. But not yet. For a few more hours, they could let the children be children. For a few more hours, they could sit in the car and exist in this liminal space between the life they'd had and the life they'd been handed. For a few more hours, they didn't have to be king and queen. Just a few more hours. William took Kate's hand in the darkness, and together they sat watching the sunrise, paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, a new day beginning, whether they were ready or not. The door to their old life had closed. The door to what came next stood open, waiting. They would walk through it together. They always had, but not yet. Not quite yet.